Today I'm here to talk to you about the future of enterprise cloud. Now, if you're an IT nerd like myself, or actually Tim, you know why enterprise cloud is such a hot topic right now. But for some of you, or potentially most of you who are not IT nerds, I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking to you about why it's such a hot topic and why it's so important right now. So to do that, I'll first go over what the enterprise cloud is and talk about market size and trends. And then I'll go over enterprise cloud models and look at two cases in the form of Dropbox and the city of Asheville, North Carolina. And then lastly, I'll talk about choosing the right model for your organization. So jumping first into what enterprise cloud actually is, very, very broadly speaking, enterprise cloud is just a computing environment behind a firewall that delivers software, infrastructure, platform, or even web services to an enterprise. Now, in terms of why enterprises are so interested in this right now, there's a lot of benefits to it, but the main ones that cloud providers are highlighting is the lower IT capital expenditure, as well as the lower software development costs, and just the increased capacity to manage peaks in demand. But that being said, the enterprise cloud isn't all unicorns and rainbows. There's also challenges involved in implementing it. And the primary ones are the integration of data and applications, as well as just compatibility across infrastructure. So to give you an example, say you have an application in your private cloud, but the data for it is in the public cloud. IT has to make sure that the application knows to look for that data externally in order to function. So in terms of why this actually matters, it's because the market size for cloud is just growing tremendously as perceptions of cloud changes. So if you were to ask a CIO even 5 years ago whether or not they were looking to adopt cloud, a lot of them will probably tell you no, just because of a lot of security concerns. But a more recent Statista survey, which is the chart on the left there, a lot of 64% of IT admins who either were in decision-making or decision-influencing positions said that they viewed cloud as being somewhat or much more secure than legacy systems, which is why, as the chart on the right shows, compared to 2013, we're expecting the market size to double to as much as $165 billion by 2019. So what this means for a lot of IT is that regardless of whether or not you're a tech company, a retail company, CPG, whatever it is, there's both more desire as well as pressure to move towards cloud. Now looking at the three different models that companies are adopting, there's private, which is just infrastructure operated solely for your organization. And it can be managed internally by your own IT personnel or managed externally. And it could also be hosted internally or externally. The public is sort of the opposite of that, in which a service provider makes resources available to your organization. The nice thing about that is you don't have to worry about maintaining your own environment, but downside is also that you have less control over that environment. And the model that we're seeing more and more companies adopt is the hybrid cloud, which, as it suggests and as the visual suggests, is sort of a bridge in between private and public. And what this means is that organizations are using a combination of public as well as private. So now that you know the different models, I'd like to first look at the Dropbox case study, which is pretty interesting in that they're one of the few cases where a company that started off in public cloud is transitioning into the private cloud. The rationale they gave for the strategic move was that they were growing to a point where it no longer made economic sense for them to stay in the public cloud, and that they would actually be more financially efficient in a private cloud. But the reason there's so few companies that make this transition is that it's incredibly difficult to move from public to private and making sure that you don't disrupt services to your customers. So as Dan Williams, who is the infrastructure guru at Dropbox, sort of described it, it's like moving a car while changing the tire, but still driving. The jury is still out on whether or not this was the right strategic move for Dropbox. But what is interesting is that Zynga made a similar move when they were experiencing hypergrowth. But as soon as they saw their sort of growth stall, they were suddenly left with all of this infrastructure. And interestingly, they're now back in the public cloud. So something to mull over. Next is the city of Asheville, North Carolina, which recently won the City in a Cloud competition for having done hybrid cloud right. Now, what that means is when the CIO, Jonathan Feldman, got to the city of Asheville, they had both their own private data center as well as a disaster recovery center, but both of them were in the physical city of Asheville, which sort of negated the disaster recovery. In case something happened in Asheville, everything is gone anyway. So Feldman sort of looked to the cloud to provide geographic spread for their disaster recovery facility, which also meant that they had to maintain one less location within their own city, and they were able to realize financial returns and also consistency in case something does happen in the city. All right, so now that we've looked at both case studies, in terms of recommending the right cloud model, I wouldn't say there's just one right cloud model. It really depends on your organization and where you are, as well as what your needs are. But in terms of when to choose private cloud, if your company has enough geographic spread already, then the disaster recovery use case doesn't make as much sense. And similar to Dropbox, if the volume of data and applications you have just no longer makes sense to stay in public, then it makes sense to move private. In terms of the public cloud, I think the main value proposition is primarily for startups. By staying in public, you can get started without having to spend a lot of upfront money on just infrastructure or networking. It also means you can start developing applications and build off of existing platforms instead of starting from scratch. But I think, as I mentioned before, hybrid is sort of the model that most people are moving towards. And I think part of the reason is to offload some of that risk. And by that I mean, unless you are a Microsoft, a Google, or just a tech company in which your core competency really is maintaining infrastructure and networks, you're inheriting a lot of risk by trying to manage everything internally. And you can offload some of that risk by making sure you have a disaster recovery facility in the public cloud. And most importantly, I think there's also a lot of organizations have non-mission critical applications that tend to just sit in their data centers for forever. And it can be much cheaper to maintain some of that in a public space than in your own private infrastructure.